Good evening and welcome back to Cecilia. We continue. Chapter 2. A Broad Hint. The next day Cecilia, to drive Delphi a little from her thoughts, which she now no longer wished him to occupy, again made a visit to Miss Belfield, whose society afforded her more consolation than any other she could procure. She found her employed in packing up, and preparing to remove to another lodging, for her brother, she said, was so much better that he did not think it right to continue in so disgraceful a situation. She talked with her accustomed openness of her affairs, and the interest which Cecilia involuntarily took in them contributed to lessen her vexation in thinking of her own. "The generous friend of my brother," said she, "who, though but a new acquaintance to him, has courted him in all his sorrows, when everybody else forsook him, has brought him at last into a better way of thinking. He says there is a gentleman whose son is soon going abroad, who he is sure will like my brother vastly, and in another week he is to be introduced to him. And so, if my mother can but reconcile herself to parting with him, perhaps we may all do well again." "Your mother," said Cecilia, "when he is gone, will better know the value of the blessing she has left in her daughter." "Oh no, madam, no. She is wrapped up in him, and cares nothing for all the world besides. It was always so, and we have all of us been used to it. But we have had a sad scene since you were so kind as to come last. For when she told him what you had done, he was almost out of his senses with anger that we had acquainted you with his distress, and he said it was publishing his misery, and undoing whatever his friend or himself could do, for it was making him ashamed to appear in the world, even when his affairs might be better. But I told him again and again that you had as much sweetness as goodness, and instead of hurting his reputation, would do him nothing but credit." "I am sorry," said Cecilia, "Mrs. Belfield mentioned the circumstance at all. It would have been better, for many reasons, that he should not have heard of it." "She hoped it would please him," answered Miss Belfield. "However, he made us both promise we would take no such step in future, for he said we were not reduced to so much indigence, whatever he was, and that as to our accepting money from other people, that we might save up our own for him, it would be answering no purpose, for he should think himself a monster to make use of it." "And what said your mother?" "Why, she gave him a great many promises that she would never vex him about it again. And indeed, much as I know we are obliged to you, madam, and gratefully as I am sure I would lay down my life to serve you, I am very glad in this case that my brother has found it out. For though I so much wish to do something for himself, and not to be so proud and live in the manner he has no right to do, I think for all that it is a great disgrace to my poor father's honest memory to have us turn beggars after his death, when he left us all so well provided for, if we had but known how to be satisfied." "There is a natural rectitude in your heart," said Cecilia, "that the ablest casuist could not mend." She then inquired whither they were removing, and Miss Belfield told her to Portland Street, Oxford Road, where they were to have 2 apartments up 2 pairs of stairs, and the use of a very good parlour, in which her brother might see his friends. "And this," added she, "is a luxury for which nobody can blame him, because if he has not the appearance of a decent home, no gentleman will employ him." The Paddington house, she said, was already let, and her mother was determined not to hire another, but still to live as penuriously as possible, in order, notwithstanding his remonstrances, to save all she could of her income for her son. Here the conversation was interrupted by the entrance of Mrs. Belfield, who very familiarly said she came to tell Cecilia they were all in the wrong box for letting her son know of the £10 banknote. "For," continued she, "he has a pride that would grace a duke, and he thinks of nothing of his hardships, so long as nobody knows of them. So another time we must manage things better, and when we do him any good, not let him know a word of the matter. We'll settle it all among ourselves, and one day or other he'll be glad enough to thank us." Cecilia, who saw Miss Belfield colour with shame at the freedom of this hint, now arose to depart, but Mrs. Belfield begged her not to go so soon, and pressed her with such urgency to sit down again, that she was obliged to comply. She then began a warm commendation of her son, lavishly praising all his good qualities, and exalting even his defects, concluding with saying, "But, ma'am, for all he's such a complete gentleman, and for all he's made so much of, he was so diffident I could not get him to call and thank you for the present you made him, though when he went his last airing I almost knelt to him to do it. With all his merit, He wants as much encouragement as a lady, for I can tell you it is not a little will do for him." Cecilia, amazed at this extraordinary speech, looked from the mother to the daughter in order to discover its meaning, which, however, was soon rendered plainer by what followed. "But pray now, ma'am, don't think him the more ungrateful for his shyness, for young ladies so high in the world as you are must go pretty good lengths before a young man will get courage to speak to 'em. And though I have told my son over and over that the ladies never like a man the worse for being a little bold, he's so much down in the mouth that it has no effect upon him. But it all comes of his being brought up at the university, for that makes him think he knows better than I can tell him. And so to be sure he does. However, for all that, it is a hard thing upon a mother to find all she says goes just for nothing. But I hope you'll excuse him, ma'am, for it's nothing in the world but his over-modesty." Cecilia now stared with a look of so much astonishment and displeasure that Mrs. Belfield, suspecting she had gone rather too far, added, "I beg you won't take what I've said amiss, ma'am, for we mothers of families are more used to speak out than maiden ladies, and I should not have said so much, but only I was afraid you would misconstrue my son's backwardness, and so that he might be flung out of your favour at last, and all for nothing but having too much respect for you." "Oh, dear mother," cried Miss Belfield, whose face was the colour of scarlet, "pray—" "What's the matter now?" cried Mrs. Belfield. "You are as shy as your brother, and if we are all to be so, when are we to come to an understanding?" "Not immediately, I believe, indeed," said Cecilia, rising. "But that we may not plunge deeper in our mistakes, I will for the present take my leave." "No, ma'am," cried Mrs. Belfield, stopping her. "Pray don't go yet, for I've a great many things I want to talk to you about. In the first place, ma'am, pray what is your opinion of this scheme for sending my son abroad into foreign parts? I don't know what you may think of it, but as to me, it half drives me out of my senses to have him taken away from me at last in that unnatural manner. And I'm sure, ma'am, if you would only put in a word against it, I dare say he would give it up without a demur." "Me?" cried Cecilia, disengaging herself from her hold. "No, madam, you must apply to those friends who better understand his affairs, and would have a deeper interest in detaining him." "Lack-a-day!" cried Mrs. Belfield with scarcely smothered vexation. "How hard is it to make these grand young ladies come to reason? As to my son's other friends, what good would it do him to mind what they say? Who could expect him to give up his journey without knowing what amends he shall get for it?" "You must settle this matter with him at your leisure," said Cecilia. "I cannot now stay another moment." Mrs. Belfield, again finding she had been precipitate, tried to draw back, saying, "Pray, ma'am, don't let what I have mentioned go against my son in your good opinion, for he knows no more of it than the furthest person in the world, as my daughter can testify. For as to shyness, he's just as shy as the lady himself, so what good he ever got at the university as to the manner of making his fortune is what I never could discover. However, I dare say he knows best. Though when all comes to all, if I was to speak my mind, I think he's made but a poor hand of it." Cecilia, who only through compassion to the blushing Henrietta forbore repressing this forwardness more seriously, merely answered Mrs. Belfield by wishing her good morning. But while she was taking a kinder leave of her timid daughter, the mother added, "As to the present, ma'am, he was so kind to make us. As he can witness me, every penny of it shall go to my son." "I rather meant it," said Cecilia, "for your daughter. But if it is of use to anybody, my purpose is sufficiently answered." Mrs. Belfield again pressed her to sit down, but she would not again listen to her, coldly saying, "I am sorry you troubled Mr. Belfield with any mention of what passed between his sister and me, but should you speak of it again, I beg you will explain to him that he had no concern in that little transaction, which belonged wholly to ourselves." She then hastened downstairs, followed, however, by Mrs. Belfield, making awkward excuses for what she had said, intermixed with frequent hints that she knew all the time she was in the right. This little incident, which convinced Cecilia Mrs. Belfield was firmly persuaded she was in love with her son, gave her much uneasiness. She feared the son himself might entertain the same notion, and thought it most probable the daughter also had imbibed it, though but for the forward vulgarity of the sanguine mother, their opinions might long have remained concealed. Her benevolence towards them, notwithstanding its purity, must now therefore cease to be exerted. Nor could she even visit Miss Belfield, since prudence and a regard for her own character seemed immediately to prohibit all commerce with the family. "And thus difficult," cried she, "is the blameless use of riches, though all who want them think nothing so easy as their disposal. This family I have so much wished to serve, I may at last only have injured, since the disappointment of their higher expectations may render all smaller benefits contemptible. And thus this unfortunate misconstruction of my good offices robs them of a useful assistant, and deprives me at the same time of an amiable companion. As soon as she returned home, she had a letter put into her hand which came from Mr. Marriott, whose servant had twice called for an answer in the short time she had been absent. This letter contained a most passionate avowal of the impression she had made on his heart the preceding evening, and an angry complaint that Mr. Harrel had refused to hear his proposals. He entreated her permission to wait upon her for only 5 minutes, and concluded with the most fervent professions of respect and admiration. The precipitancy of this declaration served merely to confirm the opinion she had already conceived of the weakness of his understanding, but the obstinacy of Mr. Harrel irritated and distressed her. Though weary of expostulating with so hopeless a subject, whom neither reason nor gratitude could turn from his own purposes, she was obliged to submit to his management, and was well content in the present instance to affirm his decree. She therefore wrote a concise answer to her new admirer, in the usual form of civil rejection. Chapter 3. An Accommodation. Cecilia was informed the next morning that a young woman begged to speak with her, and upon sending for her upstairs, she saw to her great surprise Miss Delvile. No, she didn't. She saw to her great surprise Miss Belfields. She came in fear and trembling, sent, she said, by her mother to entreat her pardon for what had passed the preceding day. But I know, madam, she added, you cannot pardon it, and therefore all that I mean to do is to clear my brother from any share in what was said, for indeed he has too much sense to harbour any such presumption, and to thank you with a most grateful heart for all the goodness you have shown us. And then, modestly curtsying, she would have returned home, but Cecilia, much touched by her gentleness, took her hand, and kindly reviving her by assurances of esteem, entreated that she would lengthen her stay. How good is this, madam, said she, after having so much reason to think so ill of me, and of all of us? I tried all in my power to undeceive my mother, or at least to keep her quiet, but she was so much persuaded she was right, that she never would listen to me, and always said, did I suppose it was for me you condescended to come so often? Yes, answered Cecilia, most undoubtedly. Had I not known you, however well I might have wished your brother, I should certainly not have visited at his house. But I am very happy to hear the mistake had spread no further. No, indeed, madam, I never once thought of it. And as to my brother, when my mother only hinted it to him, he was quite angry. But though I don't mean to vindicate what has happened, you will not, I hope, be displeased if I say my mother is much more pardonable than she seems to be. For the same mistake she made with you, she would have been as apt to make with a princess. It was not therefore from any want of respect, but merely from thinking my brother might marry as high as he pleased, and believing no lady would refuse him, if he would but have the courage to speak. Cecilia assured her she would think no more of the error, but told her that to avoid its renewal she must decline calling upon her again until her brother was gone. She begged therefore to see her in Portman Square whenever she had leisure, repeatedly assuring her of her good opinion and regard, and of the pleasure with which she should seize every opportunity of showing them. Delighted by a reception so kind, Miss Belfield remained with her all the morning, and when at last she was obliged to leave her, she was but too happy in being solicited to repeat her visit. She suffered one day only to elapse before she showed her readiness to accept the friendship that was offered her, and Cecilia, much pleased by this eagerness, redoubled her efforts to oblige and to serve her. From this time hardly a day passed in which she did not call in Portman Square, where nothing in her reception was omitted that could contribute to her contentment. Cecilia was glad to employ her mind in any way that related not to Delvile, whom she now earnestly endeavoured to think of no more, denying herself even the pleasure of talking of him with Miss Belfield by the name of her brother's noble friend. During this time she devised various methods, all too delicate to give even the shadow of offence, for making both useful and ornamental presents to her new favourite, with whom she grew daily more satisfied, and whom she purposed hereafter offering a residence in her own house. The trial of intimacy, so difficult to the ablest to stand, and from which even the most faultless are so rarely acquitted, Miss Belfield sustained with honour. Cecilia found her artless, ingenuous, and affectionate. Her understanding was good, though no pains had been taken to improve it. Her disposition, though ardent, was soft, and her mind seemed informed by intuitive integrity. She communicated to Cecilia all the affairs of her family, disguising from her neither distress nor meanness, and seeking to palliate nothing but the grosser parts of the character of her mother. She seemed equally ready to make known to her even the most chosen secrets of her own bosom, for that such she had was evident from a frequent appearance of absence and uneasiness which she took but little trouble to conceal. Cecilia, however, trusted not herself in the present critical situation of her own mind with any inquiries that might lead to a subject she was conscious she ought not to dwell upon. A short time, she hoped, would totally remove her suspense, but as she had much less reason to expect good than evil, she made it her immediate study to prepare for the worst, and therefore carefully avoided all discourse that by nourishing her tenderness might weaken her resolution. While thus in friendly conversation and virtuous forbearance passed gravely but not unhappily the time of Cecilia, the rest of the house was very differently employed. Feasting, revelling, amusements of all sorts were pursued with more eagerness than ever, and the alarm which so lately threatened their destruction seemed now merely to heighten the avidity with which they were sought. Yet never was the disunion of happiness and diversion more striking and obvious. Mr. Harrel, in spite of his natural levity, was seized from time to time with fits of horror that embittered his gayest moments, and cast a cloud upon all his enjoyments. Always an enemy to solitude, he now found it wholly insupportable, and ran into company of any sort, less from a hope of finding entertainment than from a dread of spending half an hour by himself. Cecilia, who saw that his rapacity for pleasure increased with his uneasiness, once more ventured to speak with his lady upon the subject of reformation, counselling her to take advantage of his present apparent discontent, which showed at least some sensibility of his situation, in order to point out to him the necessity of an immediate inspection into his affairs, which, with a total change in his way of life, was her only chance for snatching him from the dismal despondency into which he was sinking. Mrs. Harrel declared herself unequal to following this advice, and said that her whole study was to find Mr. Harrel amusement, for he was grown so ill-humoured and petulant she quite feared being alone with him. The house, therefore, now was more crowded than ever, and nothing but dissipation was thought of. Among those who upon this plan were courted to it, the foremost was Mr. Maurice, who, from a peculiar talent of united servility of conduct with gaiety of speech, made himself at once so agreeable and useful in the family that in a short time they fancied it impossible to live without him. And Maurice, though his first view in obtaining admittance had been the cultivation of his acquaintance with Cecilia, was perfectly satisfied with the turn that manners had taken, since his utmost vanity had never led him to entertain any matrimonial hopes with her, and he thought his fortune as likely to profit from the civility of her friends as of herself. For Maurice, however flighty and wild, had always at heart the study of his own interest, and though from a giddy forwardness of disposition he often gave offence, his meaning and his serious attention was not the less directed to the advancement of his own affairs. He formed no connection from which he hoped not some benefit, and he considered the acquaintance and friendship of his superiors in no other light than that of procuring him sooner or later recommendations to new clients. Sir Robert Floyer, also, was more frequent than ever in his visits, and Mr. Harrel, notwithstanding the remonstrances of Cecilia, contrived every possible opportunity of giving him access to her. Mrs. Harrel herself, though hitherto neutral, now pleaded his cause with earnestness, and Mr. Arnott, who had been her former refuge from this persecution, grew so serious and so tender in his devoirs that, unable any longer to doubt the sentiments she had inspired, she was compelled even with him to be guarded and distant. She now with daily concern looked back to the sacrifice she had made to the worthless and ungrateful Mr. Harrel, and was sometimes tempted to immediately choose another guardian and leave his house for ever. Yet the delicacy of her disposition was averse to any step that might publicly expose him, and her early regard for his wife would not suffer her to put it in execution. These circumstances contributed strongly to increase her intimacy with Miss Belfield. She now never saw Mrs. Delvile, whom alone she preferred to her, and from the troublesome assiduity of Sir Robert, scarce ever met Mr. Monckton but in his presence. She found, therefore, no resource against teasing and vexation, but what was afforded her by the conversation of the amiable Henrietta. Well, I am rather tired, and I think I have not necessarily read that terribly well, but a few things standing out. We can see the beginnings of a couple of Austen characters here, I think. I wonder if you share my view on that. Let me know. And I feel that there's an interesting theme in Cecilia of brilliant or potentially brilliant sons who are not able to be themselves because of stifling parental influence. The story of Mr. Belfield is remarkably similar to the story of Mrs. Hill's son, if you remember, the one who all Mrs. Hill's hopes were pinned on until he died, and she still can't take any care of her remaining children because she's so obsessed with her son. And here again we have Belfield and Mrs. Belfield who can't look to her daughters because of her obsession with her son, and how that has ruined all their lives, just as it's ruining the Hills. And I think they have to be parallels for Delvile, the only son of this ancient family that values family above absolutely everything else, and the way that the various hopes and dreams of Mr. and Mrs. Delvile, which may or may not be the same and may or may not be different to each other's, are absolutely all pinned on this one heir, this only son. And I feel that is definitely a theme that Burney is exploring here. And I wonder, we'll have to see how it develops, how that contrasts with Cecilia as the only daughter and an heiress, who is herself in the active position that you would expect a son to be in. She's got the money, she will have the independence, and yet she's being controlled by these parental figures. And yet she's a woman. So I feel like there's something going on here. I feel like there's a theme that's being developed, but as yet it is not laying itself out to me in perfect order, but I think it's there. So we shall have to follow this as the novel continues, and we still have a great deal of the novel that will continue. Good night.